Welcome to this podcast. Today we have Rebecca Black, psychologist, here to talk about pregnancy loss. Hi, I'm Karen, the founder of Pregactive, and through this Pregactive podcast, I'm going to help you to feel empowered, informed, and confident through your pregnancy and motherhood journey as we talk all things health, mind, and fitness. So, Beck, thank you so much for coming on today's podcast with us. And for those who haven't met you before or heard about you, because we have other podcasts with you, could you just give us a little bit of a rundown as to who you are and what you do?
Thank you so much for having me, Kez. So, my name is Rebecca Black. I'm a perinatal psychologist, mum of 3 beautiful children, and the founder and director of the Mindful Birth Movement, which is an organization that supports women on their pregnancy, birth, and motherhood journey.
So let's talk into pregnancy loss, a really important topic, one that you work with a lot as well. And let's get started talking about it because I think that's one of the things is people don't necessarily talk about it.
Yeah. And I guess before we dive in, I really want to encourage mums listening to this podcast to really go gently because I'm sure there's many who are listening that have very personal experience with this topic, because 1 in 4 pregnancies in Australia end in miscarriage, which means that around 285 miscarriages occur every day in Australia. So it is a really prevalent thing, but like you said, it's very much not spoken about or sometimes not even acknowledged by people and those that are around them. So I'm really grateful for you for doing this podcast episode with me today.
That is so it's crazy, the stats. And I think a lot of women are lost when it happens, obviously, and there's different stages that this can happen.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people assume that, a miscarriage occurs in those early stages, and that can often be quite minimized or invalidated for women who have an early term miscarriage, because people are quite insensitive, or maybe the woman hasn't even shared that she was pregnant yet, which is really hard when society kind of gives us this message that we shouldn't tell people that we're pregnant until we've passed that first trimester, which I think is actually quite backwards. I think women, if they feel comfortable, should feel safe to share that news, because if a loss does occur, I think it's even more important for people to know that they were carrying and that they're going through this period of grief and loss post a miscarriage. But like you said, miscarriage isn't just something that occurs in that first trimester. There's all different forms of grief and loss that can occur, whether it's a later term miscarriage, a stillbirth, a termination for medical reasons, and different forms of grief and loss in the conception and fertility space as well. So there's a lot of different layers to this space, I guess.
And going back to that, I think that exactly as you said, that first trimester, I know a lot of women who are so scared in that first trimester, particularly because of, society being, don't tell anyone. And it's like, well, don't tell anyone. And then why don't tell anyone? Everybody has their own decision on that.
Yeah.
But it's really important that we do support women through that journey. And this is a big one. When there is loss, a lot of people don't know what to say or do. And in many situations, people hold back and stay away and don't really bring up the topic because they don't want to mess it up. They don't want to say anything wrong.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it is a really common response from support people to hold back from saying the wrong thing, or from fear of saying the wrong thing, I guess. But what I often say to people is that woman who's experienced loss is grieving and in that space, regardless of whether you say something or don't say something. And so, I think you being able to honor and acknowledge the fact that she is experiencing this loss is really powerful, as opposed to not saying anything at all. Because something that's quite unique about pregnancy loss is that it can be quite an invisible grief, or a grief that nobody really acknowledges or understands or speaks about. And so if we could bring that grief and loss into the light and give that person space to talk about it, sit with them while they're feeling their big emotions, it can be really, really powerful.
And you talk about different, I guess, models or grief models. And can you go a little bit more into that detail?
Yeah, I guess working as a perinatal psychologist, I've done specialised training with the Perinatal Loss Institute in Australia around the different models of grief and how we can use these models of grief to support a woman as she moves through her loss. Like I said, regardless of whether that's a miscarriage or a stillbirth or different forms of loss. I think before we get into, I guess, helping a woman move through her grief, I think it's really important to be with her and sit, listen, and hold space for someone who is experiencing this loss. Because I think a lot of the time, particularly with early pregnancy loss, there's a real sense of urgency to make her feel okay again, rather than giving her permission to feel exactly as she does, and that's okay, and that it's okay to sit in that space. Comments like, oh, at least you know you can get pregnant, or you could just try again, doesn't really acknowledge the enormity of the loss that she's experiencing, and that this was, in her mind, her baby. And for many women, they've already imagined their future with their baby. They've got hopes, they've got dreams, and the loss isn't of something that they had that's gone. It's something that they imagine they would have. And so, this can occur even if you only knew you were pregnant for a day. You've already had this time to visualize and imagine, and you've probably been doing that for months or years prior to falling pregnant. So I think really giving women permission to experience that grief and sit in that space and being able to hold that space is really important. And then some of the models, I guess, that I work within to support women as they move through their grief, there's a model called continuing bonds, and it's this idea that it's actually okay for you to hold on to a connection with your baby, your lost baby, whether that's through rituals or a symbol, or naming your baby and being able to continue talking about your baby. So being able to support a family, a woman and the father, to create a bond with their lost baby can actually be a really powerful way to honor their grief and help them continue to honor their baby as well. So that's one of the models that I really think is quite powerful for women in this space.
That is so beautiful. I think that's so important that women do continue on to not feel like, well, the baby was never here, so then let's never acknowledge it. So yeah, a lot of people have the rainbow babies and the angel babies, and even when they're talking about their family, they mention them as well, and that's really beautiful. It's
Yeah.
obviously sad. It's really hard and really sad, but continuing to talk it through is really important.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that, if a woman is able to have a subsequent baby after loss, it doesn't actually negate their grief or make their grief go away. It doesn't mean that that part of them is healed because now they have this new baby. It's really recognizing that they can hold both at the same time, that they can have this joy and hope and excitement for this new pregnancy or this new rainbow baby, whilst at the very same time they're still going to feel grief and loss for the baby that they've lost. So I think that's a really important concept to understand, that it doesn't just mean that somebody moves on from their grief once they've felt pregnant again or have their next baby.
Well, I think what you talked about holding space is so important, and a lot of people don't know how to do that because there's filling the gap. You know, there's silence, and so they'll fill the gap with anything, and that's in any social setting.
Yeah.
They'll just talk, and it's that silence and that allowing the space and allowing that to come, and it might not be the first time either, right? Like somebody would open up maybe when they feel a bit safer about talking about it to you. So staying with that would be really important.
And checking back in, I think, again, it's not something that you grieve and you get over, right? It's something that they will actually hold with them for the rest of their lives. So having the courage to check in with that person or that friend and regularly acknowledge that they're still holding that grief and that you're there for them. And like you said, being able to hold space can feel quite uncomfortable if you haven't done that before, but silence can be really powerful, and just sitting with them, if it's somebody you're, intimate with or have a really strong relationship with, it might look like holding their hand or, rubbing their arm or just being with them in the space. So it doesn't always mean that you have to know the exact right thing to say or have all these beautiful words. Just being with them can really make a huge difference.
Definitely. And that's what we want to get across, I guess, with this podcast is this is a resource for people who are around women who have had pregnancy loss to have a better understanding as to potentially what they are going through and how you can support them. And this is a resource for pregnant women who potentially have had a loss themselves, that these are some tips and techniques to be able to use.
Yeah.
So what would be anything that you could say to somebody when there's a loss later in the pregnancy? Would there be any different tips or techniques?
I think, often if it's a later pregnancy loss, so from 20 weeks onwards in pregnancy, a loss would be called a stillbirth. So I think that, that feels quite conflicting to me, because I think a loss at 19 weeks is just as significant as a loss at 20 weeks. But it's interesting how the terminology shifts, and it, from a medical standpoint is treated quite differently. But I think if it's a later term loss, often that will look like, baby being given a name and potentially having a funeral, and there's some extra kind of components of a loss at that stage. So something that I think can be really powerful is asking, what their baby's name was and being able to use that in conversation. I have, clients that I see now, years on from the loss that they experienced, a stillbirth, and we still talk about their baby. And, these women will talk about being a mother of 3, 2 living babies and 1 baby who passed away. And they're regularly spoken about in their kind of family kind of conversations and around the dinner table. And so I think as a friend or as a support person, being able to use their baby's name and check in on them on significant dates or kind of occasions, and reference their baby that they're missing. Because trust me when I say they're in it and they feel it. So you're not going to make them feel worse. You're actually going to make them feel seen and understood and supported.
And when it comes to subsequent pregnancy, I've had women who have come to my Preg Active classes and talked to me initially about their loss in a previous pregnancy and their level of anxiety of the discussion that's going to happen. Do you have more children? Is this your first baby? And that even just them talking it out through to me initially in the space that we were in before then potentially that conversation will start again, they it's a processing for them, because they know that the questions are coming from a good space.
Yeah.
These are questions that are coming with excitement and joy about pregnancy from the mothers who potentially may not have experienced loss, or they have and they're not talking about their experience then, and they want to focus on the positive. So it's a really big space, but having that acknowledgement that that's a question, and having the answer and having what you want to say, even if it's hard to say. But what this one woman I remember saying to me was, I'm going to answer and I'm going to say, no, this is not my first, and talk about that in a light way.
And I think, it's a really great thing that you brought up for women to recognize that they're going to be put in those situations that might feel quite uncomfortable, and thinking about how they might answer those questions. And when I work with women in session, I often encourage them to really tune into what feels right for them in any given moment, because there's no right or wrong here. If you feel like you need to say, yeah, this is my first and I'm really excited, because you don't have the capacity on that particular day, or with that particular person, you just don't want to be vulnerable or go there, that is so okay. But if you feel like you really want to honor the loss of your baby and be sharing that with people, then please honor that too, because I think more often than not, women feel uncomfortable saying or talking about their loss, a little bit because it's obviously hard and a really emotional topic, but a lot of that stems from society being uncomfortable with talking about hard things, and society feeling like it's a taboo topic, and makes other people uncomfortable. So I feel like often women hold back because of that, because they don't want to make the other person feel uncomfortable. But I kind of say, what is it that you need? And, the more we can start opening up these conversations, hopefully we can shift that narrative and shift the idea that it actually is okay to acknowledge this and talk about it.
Exactly. And that is why we're here,
Yeah.
to bring this up. And there are a lot of resources out there, and we will certainly be putting them in the description below. But if you have any other, resources that you wanted to share in this space now.
Yeah, so there's some really amazing services and resources available in the community in Australia. So we've got SANS, which is an amazing charity that provides support to women who've had stillbirth. There's Red Nose, there's the Pink Elephant Support Network, and Miscarriage Australia. So I'll get Kez to put those links in the show notes for you. If you do really resonate with this topic and you feel like you need some extra support with a psychologist, please reach out to us. We would love to provide that support. And also really honoring that, whether you had a loss, in the last few months or the last year, or maybe years and years ago, it's something that we hold with us forever. So, maybe you do want to revisit that and honor that and acknowledge the loss that you've experienced, even if it was a long time ago. So, there's lots of services and supports available.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Beck. And know that this is just an invaluable resource for so many people.
Thanks for having me, Kez.